So the topic of this video is regarding selecting an issue to research. Um, it's a big it's a big decision um, in the context of a course, in the context of maybe a capstone experience for an education program, master's degree, doctorate, etc. It's also a big issue for a career of what is it that you would like to research, and how do we come to this conclusion? I believe it's a combination of factors. One that we might want to ignore is life experiences. What we've done with our careers, what we've done in life in general, how we were raised, all those contextual factors invariably have an impact on what we are interested in. There's a belief in the research world that all things should be objective. That's a very difficult thing to do. I would argue that it's actually impossible, that we can't always be objective. And I think one way where that is especially true is selecting something to research. So as we go through that process, we also have to engage in a process of narrowing things down. So as I've discussed elsewhere, I think of this as a funnel. So we're starting with a really big idea, and at the end of the day, we got to get right down to basically 1 to 4 questions we want to ask or that we want to answer. And that is a challenging process. Usually people pick topics that are way too broad. And I want to share with you a personal example that maybe will help some of you as you walk through this process. So, having done my undergrad in special education, I ended up teaching high school special ed, and became quite disillusioned with what that meant, what all that entailed, and ultimately what the outcomes were for kids who were in special ed. So it was something that I'd already been quite passionate about, but when I got into the workforce, I became even more passionate about. So I actually decided to study more in the field of sociology and anthropology. And as I got into that program, I eventually settled on alternative education, which is not really, it wasn't then, that would have been in the late 1990s. And it really wasn't a new concept then, but it had a resurgence actually because of, actually one reason is due to the, at that point, recent school shootings. But I really was interested in looking at it from the perspective of kids with disabilities. So my belief and that I had a great passion about was that our current system just wasn't the direction we should be going. So I wanted to look at these alternative programs and consider, are kids working in are kids in those programs, and does it work for them? So I shared that because it was something I was very passionate about, and it led me to this topic. So I ended up doing that a master's thesis on that topic, and eventually, as I went to the University of Oregon, my advisor actually used some of my work to get a grant that actually funded me to do research on alternative education. And actually, you've probably seen that article. It was a lot of work that went into that. But once again, my how did I decide to study alternative education? It was something I was really passionate about, and as I see in the topics from classes that students are choosing, there are things where we want to bring about change. Once again, some people would say, well, that's not our role. And that is a difference between applied and basic research. I would agree that within basic research, that, the researcher, even though I don't always believe, or I don't know that it's even possible, you shouldn't necessarily be passionate about your subject area. Whereas in applied research, kind of the point is to bring about change, or to not maybe directly through the research, but that the research may have an impact on a policy that will eventually bring about change. So, I don't get too hung up on, you have to be detached from your research. You do have to be objective in many ways, but we also need to be aware that that's largely impossible to be completely objective. So, those are the reasons why you might end up at the top of the funnel. And there are other reasons as you start to narrow down, because what we realize is we often choose topics that are way, way too broad. For example, with alternative education. Well, that was just a huge topic. Alternative education. It's been going on since the 1960s. This was the late 90s, in the early 2000s. And I couldn't, that was not a researchable topic, or something to do a dissertation on or a thesis. So I had to really narrow that down to, what do these services, generally speaking, what do these services look like for kids with disabilities? How do alternative schools interact with the juvenile justice system? So you see how over time, and it took a lot of work. It took a lot of work with my advisor to start really narrowing that funnel down to those broad ideas, to very specific questions that you want to answer. So this is where we start, and where we end is ultimately with those questions, and then in real life answering those questions. In this context, we are just developing the proposal to answer the questions. So deciding on a research issue is kind of the easy part, because we can get there usually quite quickly. But we do have to focus on this narrowing down process and using the funnel. So that is a little bit of an overview on selecting an issue to do research on.